microphone? Oh, now it's on. Welcome to our November 29th work session on inclusionary housing. And I will kick things off here, and then we'll invite up several invited guests to talk to us about the policy. Inclusionary housing policies are an important tool to help ensure economically integrated neighborhoods across our city. It's a policy that can give working Portlanders the possibility of living in the neighborhood they work. It can give children the possibility of living in a mixed income building and an economically diverse neighborhood, which research has shown time and time again can improve their educational attainment and future. Fundamentally, inclusionary housing is about opportunity and equity. This council recognized that when we unanimously chose to make this our top legislative priority, to repeal the ban on inclusionary zoning in the 2016 legislative session. We worked with advocates, community organizations, and developers to make that happen. During the process, we promised state legislators that we'd engage in a data-driven, inclusive process to develop an inclusionary housing policy in Portland, and that we wouldn't rest on our laurels. And we haven't. In the months that have passed since the repeal of the ban, we worked to put together a top-notch group of advisors, we call them our panel of experts, to provide input and data to put together the package of recommendations that are being discussed today. We also secured a nationally recognized team to provide us with a market economic analysis to carefully calibrate this policy. Today, we'll learn more about that policy from Kurt Krieger and Matt Schabold of the Portland Housing Bureau, and we will hear from members of the panel of experts and members of the Planning and Sustainability Commission, which also voted in favor of this policy. And before we turn it over to Kurt and Matt, I'd like to introduce David Rosen and Nora Lake Brown of David Rosen and Associates, who conducted our market economic analysis. David Rosen and Associates, or DRA, is widely recognized as one of the leading economic, legal, policy, and program experts in inclusionary zoning. DRA has advised more than 60 jurisdictions over the last 25 years on inclusionary housing and affordable housing linkage fees. DRA's focus practices on transactional advisory services in residential development, and DRA principals have advised on more than $9 billion of development, finance, and portfolios for affordable housing projects. And importantly, DRA's economic analysis and models for both inclusionary housing and housing linkage fee programs have been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. So David and Nora, would you like to come on up and kick things off? And Kurt and Matt will come up too. Great. Welcome, and just housekeeping, if you can hit the button at the base of your microphone when you're speaking, and then
Thank you, first of all, for the chance to serve the City of Portland on this important issue. It's our distinct pleasure to have been selected and to have the opportunity to work with a top-notch staff and a wonderful group of stakeholders and experts who devoted on a volunteer basis a significant amount of time and input in the process. In my opening remarks, I thought I'd give you a little bit of historical context, both for the subject of inclusionary housing nationally, as well as DRA's wide-ranging practice, and then ask Nora to focus her remarks on key findings and trends resulting from our analysis here in Portland. Inclusionary housing dates back 40 years to the Mount Laurel decisions by the New Jersey Supreme Court in the township of Mount Laurel, which had excluded zoning for multifamily housing, and the New Jersey Supreme Court found this exclusionary zoning to be a violation of equal access for renter families in the community, and required that Mount Laurel provide for rental housing, which was a substantial, might say, revolutionary change in the zoning of that town. That really, it kicked off 40 years of practice nationally. Some of the first jurisdictions to adopt inclusionary housing were in Columbia, Maryland, and throughout California. And today, hundreds, by some count, more than 600 jurisdictions have some form of mandatory inclusionary housing obligation. That is, conditioning the development of market rate housing on a set aside of a certain number, percentage of units as affordable at a specified income target. The trends in the last real estate cycle, dating from the mortgage crash and the last recession, which were deeply felt here and throughout the country, is for jurisdictions by the scores. We actually don't have a census. It may be by the hundreds, to strengthen existing inclusionary provisions, either by increasing the percent units set aside, deepening the income targeting, and or increasing the in lieu fee payment option. And we're seeing this as a repeating trend in our practice. As the Commissioner noted, we've advised about 60 jurisdictions over the last 25 years in this process. We've learned a couple of key lessons through a wide variety of real estate markets, jurisdictions, and geographies. One of the first lessons is that the cost of producing housing is not related to its price. And I think this is a very key finding and a fundamental principle of real estate: price, which is a function of supply and demand. And so what we often hear in response to a jurisdiction's efforts to adopt either impact fees, which this is not, or a police power action such as zoning code reform through inclusionary housing, is that developers would pass through the cost of compliance to the consumer, to the tenant, or to the home buyer. And if you think about this for a moment, this assertion, it would suggest that the developers of housing are not already charging market price for rent or sale price. In other words, that they're somehow voluntarily discounting, because otherwise the price would not be able to absorb an increase. And so,
just before you go on, could I ask a clarifying question? By and large, it would seem that the developer is not going to own the project long term. So are you going to address that? Because I don't understand why it's not the developer who's going to be managing the apartment and passing on the fee to the tenant.
well, many developers do own long-term. If we're talking about institutional asset class, sort of Class A properties for multifamily housing, rental housing, developers may own for a period of 10 years. They may sell interests in the project to investors and lenders, take collateral interest in the project. So I would say yes, for investment-grade properties, often developers do own, especially in rental housing, market rate rental housing. A second key lesson after almost 3 decades of practice here is there is an economic effect of imposing a zoning condition, as there is in any zoning condition that the city would adopt. And this effect really, it gets worked out in the price and value of land. And so if you are a landowner, your value of that land for market rate development fluctuates, as it does in response to other variables in real estate economics: the price of money, the cost of construction, the cost of materials. The methodology that we've employed to quantify the change in land value is called residual land value, which is really established as the standard for determining the effect of real estate values on development, whether we're talking about office buildings, hotels, or residential housing. When we talk about the effect on residual land value, it's important to place that in the context of land markets. And so it's been fascinating for us to see here in Portland that post-recession, land prices, while the city of Portland has done nothing to change its zoning code, have increased more than 100% when you hold zoning constant. And this is actually not a surprise to us. We've seen this in many high-cost markets throughout the United States. And so what this suggests is that the fluctuation in land price is actually highly volatile. It's highly sensitive to developers' bets or risk-taking on the near-term value of housing and what they're willing to pay for land. And so when that price is locked in a sale contract, it's a fixed cost for the developer. When it's optioned, it's a price that could be varied based on the terms of the contract. For landowners, they don't have the luxury of changing their price for the land, right? They own the land already. So there will be an effect on land value for landowners. The finding that we have seen in our practice over many years is that when a jurisdiction calibrates its land effects at about 25% of residual land value, that falls well within the standard trading range of land over real estate cycles, which we've said in this city has been more than 100%.
Can you clarify what that means, to calibrate your land effect at 25%?
What we mean by that, Commissioner, is the research which Nora conducted in collaboration with the staff and the panel of experts was to quantify the effect of alternative set-aside obligations at alternative income targets on residual land value by zoning. So we looked both in the downtown and in the mixed-use zones across Portland. And we did that under a common set of assumptions about the cost of developing those types of housing in Portland today. Does that help? Yeah. I think that guidepost, maybe 25% more or less of shifts in residual land value effects, if I may, is something that you might use as a guidepost in thinking about the range of land trading prices, which have exceeded, I mean, in some cases have been 160% in the last 3 years. The last point I would make is that we're not aware of a jurisdiction that has undertaken this effort with a intent to entirely offset that price effect. Real estate development is a risky business. Land prices, we've established, are highly volatile. Just like you have a general plan, just like you have a series of system development charges, those are done really in your police powers to promote the general welfare that you're tasked to provide for as a municipality. So as long as this is done within realistic bounds, as the legal standards establish, you're operating well within the norm of other communities. And with that, I turn this over to Nora for her particular comments in Portland.
Thank you, Commissioners. As Commissioner Saltzman mentioned, we did an economic analysis of inclusionary housing options for the city of Portland. And this was done through a highly transparent public process with a panel of experts that you'll hear from later today. And we worked very closely with this panel and with our sub-consultant, Eco Northwest, to develop both development prototypes and economic assumptions for the costs of building and the revenues and costs of operating those prototypes, reflecting the current Portland market. And as I mentioned, we went through several iterations of each of the prototypes and the assumptions with input and feedback from the panel of experts. And these resulted in what we feel are relatively conservative assumptions. They incorporated recent increases in construction costs, partly have been affected by the high production level that you've seen in Portland in the last few years, which has resulted in competition for contractors, particularly for steel and concrete high-rise construction, which has bid up prices beyond what they might otherwise have been. And as I mentioned, this is kind of associated with a massive increase in production in the past few years. We believe that the program recommendations that the Housing Bureau is presenting are feasible based on our analysis. For prototypes with above 5.0 FAR or above, the incentives really offset the costs. And this is something, as David had mentioned, that we don't often see in other cities, where the offsets substantially or fully offset the cost of the program compliance. For prototypes below the 5 FAR, especially in the mixed-use zones, we do see some reduction in land value. I think up to about 25%. In some cases, the optional 10% of units at 60% AMI actually generated better land values for the mixed-use zones than the mandatory proposed 20% at 80%, which would provide an incentive for 60% units to be developed. But when we compare that kind of 25% reduction in light of the land value fluctuations that David has mentioned, we see that looking at actual assessors data from 2010 to 2016 on transaction sales of land by zoning category and by FAR, we find that in the central city zones, we've seen increases depending on the FAR, from about 26% to 150% over that 6-year time period in land value increases. That's kind of from the beginning to the end of the period. And within that, we see a lot of volatility where the actual total swings in land value, when you include the up and down, so even if it's trending up, there are up and downs. We've seen swings of 49% to 160% in those land values. In the mixed-use zones, over the same time period, we've seen increases in land values of land prices of 24% to 123%, and again within that, even larger swings of 40 to 140%. So we believe that the possible reduction in land values resulting from the program, where they may occur, are but a fraction of the actual fluctuation that's naturally seen in the land market without the city doing this type of program or any other type of action. Thank you.
Now we'll turn it over to Kurt Krieger and Matt Schabold to walk through the proposal.
I just have one question.
Yeah.
So in the 60 jurisdictions in which you've worked, have any of them triggered a legal challenge?
Yes.
And can you generalize about the sort of the attack, the legal attack on what you're recommending?
So we advised the City of San Jose on the adoption of a citywide mandatory inclusionary housing program, which the Mayor and Council approved. The California Building Industry Association, the CBIA, challenged the San Jose ordinance as a taking under the takings provision of the U.S. Constitution. The appellate court in California upheld the the Superior Court upheld the BIA challenge. The appellate court reversed the challenge. DRA was retained as an expert witness in this litigation. And then, importantly, the California Supreme Court published a ruling upholding the San Jose ordinance as a strongly endorsed function of municipal police power to promote the general welfare, A. B, to assert that this is not a taking. C, to assert that this is not an exaction, but this functions rather than under the nexus standards of Nolan and Dolan, which govern impact fees. This operates under long established, more than a century of police power authority of municipalities. And then later this year, the U.S. Supreme Court, the BIA challenged the California Supreme Court finding to the U.S. Court, which upheld the California decision. And I've shared that decision with Commissioner Saltzman's office and the staff. So the San Jose case, as published by the California Supreme Court, is the strongest endorsement to date that we are aware of in the legal record, upholding the right of municipalities to adopt this provision.
What was the vote on the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court?
Oh, is that my gotcha question?
This was your project. I thought you'd remember every minute of it.
It was. I don't know. I think it's in the published opinion, which I've provided staff.
So I have a question which actually maybe should be postponed to later and tell me if that's true. But I mean, there's a significant difference in the incentives for the central city and base FAR 5 or above and mixed use zones. And in particular, the proposal for mixed use zones is 10-year property tax exemption on affordable units. And under central city, it's 10-year property tax exemption on all units for sites with base FAR 5.0 and above. So that seems like it's a much greater subsidy per unit in basically in high rises. Economically, is that, I mean, isn't there an argument that if it costs so much more to subsidize development in the high rises, you should just say for high rises, they pay a fee in lieu, which could be used to build more units at a lower cost somewhere else?
Well, let me answer the policy part of your question and defer to Nora the sort of implicit quantitative part of your question, Commissioner. As a matter of policy, we generally prefer the provision of units to the payment of a fee. Some of our clients prohibit the option of paying a fee. Cambridge, Massachusetts does not have that option at all. The reason is severalfold. For some, inclusionary housing, and this dates back to the Mount Laurel decision I mentioned, is really a policy aimed at promoting economic integration and preventing economic segregation caused by residential development patterns. That was the whole foundation of the Mount Laurel case. For others, it's perhaps more practical. Gee, we want to see the affordable units come online as soon as possible. And the payment of a fee, by definition, defers the development of the affordable units and makes it somewhat challenging. You have a very capable department here, and Portland, frankly, has been very good about amassing resources to promote affordable housing in the midst of your crisis. All that said, you have to find sites, you have to ramp up leverage financing from other financing sources, you have to find third-party developers. We often see in lieu fee money not hitting the ground in units until 3 to 5 years after development.
I was just going to add that, I guess building on what David said, we think that the incentives do provide a strong incentive for developers to provide the unit on site. We understand there is an in lieu fee option that will be used by some developers if those incentives, are not considered adequate or relative to the payment of the in lieu fee.
Well, I mean, one thing that I hope we can hear is what the cost per unit of the subsidy we can expect to be in various contexts, because, I mean, we've been criticized for spending too much per unit on affordable housing in general. When people have said that $200,000 to $250,000 of public investment in one unit just seems like a lot. If the subsidy for the over 5 FAR central city units is $700,000 per unit, then that strikes me as a problem. Even if it's $320,000 per unit, that strikes me as a problem. So I hope you'll walk us through what the actual cost is expected to be.
Could I just add one more comment? You began your presentation talking about opportunity and equity. You talked about economic integration as a value driving why we want to invest in affordable homes throughout the community. Recognizing that the future is going to be hard to predict, that we're likely to see some changes that are hard to predict, leave it at that. Can't you also make an argument that investing downtown in slightly higher cost units is part of our obligation to affirmatively further fair housing? If the cornerstone of that is opportunity for people across the community.
Well, I think you're asking my personal opinion. Yes, I think that economic integration is a key value to the policy of inclusionary housing. And then inclusionary housing is one, albeit a very important one, tool to be used in an overall housing strategy. And I referred to Portland having a number of tools by grace of the voters and this council, frankly. So hats off to you. I think there comes a point, and I think it might be a colloquy between the two of you, at least these two comments, where the best value for producing units lies. So if somehow we can get greater production off-site and that can be managed, that might be worth doing. New York City wrestles with this question of economic integration in high-rise buildings by arguing about what floor the affordable units are on, which personally I think is missing the point. I think the provision of the unit is more important. Other people disagree. Obviously, people have strongly held views about that. So I do think that the economic integration argument is really important. I think another key issue, which you didn't mention in your question, is commute times, proximity of jobs, housing, and transit, and making the community more viable for the families and individuals who call Portland their home, their place of work, and where they send their kids to school. So I think all of that in terms of productivity and lost commute time for families is another important consideration.
And just, I mean, to talk about, I mean, and I agree that inclusion is an important value, and I do not want to have all of the poor people or lower income people exiled to the far reaches of the city. However, at a certain point, it seems like we might face a choice between what would you rather have? One person in the high rise and one person homeless, or two people somewhere not in a high rise. And I think that we need to, know what those trade-offs are.
So now we'll turn it over to Kurt and Matt to walk us through the actual recommendations.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and good morning, everyone. Kurt Krieger, Portland Housing Bureau, and with me, Matt Scheibold, the Policy and Equity Manager for the Portland Housing Bureau. First, to paraphrase Charles Dickens, these are both the best of times and the worst of times. Developers and developer overhead and profit are reaching uncharted territory. People are making more money now than they ever dreamed they could in this marketplace. Portland has been elevated to top tier status by institutional investors and by international capital looking for profits and reliable returns. So in that regard, it's the best of times to consider looking at the total bundle of costs, as David mentioned, with respect to housing, and consider ways in which to infuse our public policy goals as a cost of doing business in Portland. And conversely, this is the worst of times for renters and would-be first-time homebuyers. As Commissioner Novick mentioned, people are economically displaced to the farther reaches of the city, if they can afford the city at all. We'll release in the next week the State of Housing 2016 edition. It's a inexorable march, if you will, a diaspora, an economic diaspora, which is forcing many working families and low-wage earners out of the city entirely. So for them, relief can come not too soon. And when you look at the history of inclusionary housing in places, Mount Laurel, certainly Montgomery County, Maryland, Fairfax, Virginia, that have had this in place for over 25 years, there is a reliable stock of permanently affordable housing connected with private developers by tapping the hydraulics of the private market and to ensure that they continue to do good business in the city of Portland. So our work these last 8 months has been to find that sweet spot, if you will, between balancing the hard and soft costs of doing business in Portland and also then extracting public value from developers as they choose to do work here. It's the art of inclusionary housing and making sure that we get that right. And I do want to commend the panel of experts and the vision of the legislature to give us these tools. It's important that you know that we retained David Rosen and Associates prior to the session even being convened, because we had full intention of going forward with a linkage fee, which we felt was perfectly permissible under Oregon statutes. When the legislature did enact Senate Bill 1533, we amended the scope of work to include this inclusionary housing work. So we've been working on this all year. And just to remind people who may be watching this for the first time at home, Senate Bill 1533 basically created a series of mileposts in how we can devise such a program. It can only be mandatory for households at 80% of the area median income and above. It can apply to rental and for sale buildings with 20 or more units. It stipulates that local governments choosing to enact inclusionary housing policies provide incentives for affordable units such as SDC, System Development Charge, or fee waivers, financing and tax exemptions, and it stipulates that a fee in lieu option be provided. Those are the statutory sort of milestones that we had to operate within. The other thing I'd like to recognize is that the panel of experts was instrumental in Nora's work as we sorted through the economics of land use and development fundamentals in Portland. Eco Northwest devised a series of typologies. Those typologies included everything from 3-story lightweight frame construction to high-rise construction. And Nora, working with the panel of experts, modeled the residual land values in each of the urban zones within Portland. So this has been evaluated at great length. We are sparing you that detail, but that detail is available should you be interested in a deep dive into the residual land values by zone. I do want to recognize that Sarah Zahn, Dyke Dame, Dr. Lisa Bates, Dr. Ronald Lear, Amanda Saul, Vivian Satterfield, Maggie Talmadge, Eric Kress, Greg Goodman, Kira Kador, and Nolan Reinhardt were all actively involved as members of the panels of experts. Some are economists, some are planners, many are advocates, and many are developers. Their interests are divergent, so they were never asked to take a group position because, frankly, getting to a consensus with such a diverse group would have diluted the effect. But they did provide to Commissioner Salzman their best thinking about ways in which to harness the private development sector without stifling growth or development or causing unintended consequences such as growth in the wrong place, growth of too many units under 20 units in size, or larger, a failure to actually achieve our 2035 comprehensive plan goals of 123,000 new housing units. The other thing I'd like to say is that in the Planning and Sustainability Commission's review, there was a great deal of attention given to the rate of inclusion and the offsets. And we made it clear at the time that it's really the City Council's domain to consider the offsets. So the Commission did have a unanimous do-pass recommendation to support the rate of inclusion as proposed, with some caveats and concerns. And we've responded in writing to those caveats and concerns, which needs to be part of this record and in preparation for your public hearing. But in listening carefully to what the Planning and Sustainability Commission had to say, Commissioner Salzman is advancing some revisions, and those revisions will be filed today, and they will be available for public review prior to the public hearing next Thursday. So the policy framework that we enacted at the very outset last winter as we undertook this effort included several important policy assumptions. First, and this is slide 5 of the handout, we wanted to ensure that this was a citywide program which calibrated the inclusion rates by different geographies. We needed to recognize the realities on the ground, differences between neighborhood costs and central city costs. Secondly, while we were able to set a mandatory program at 80% of AMI, we wanted to calibrate the incentives to more robustly encourage 60% units. This was very much an open conversation with legislative leaders during session, and that was most of our existing programs were focused to households under 60% of AMI. Your allocation of tax increment financing to housing is limited generally to households under 60% of AMI. Your prior agreement to award SDC or system development charge waivers is limited to households under 60%. And we did not want to change the policy direction of council. We wanted to reinforce the policy direction of council.
So I want to just hear that again, that we're only waiving SDCs on the affordable units, not the entire project.
That is correct.
Thank you.
And the current practice is exemplified in projects like the Yard, where there are 57 affordable units at the Yard. We are receiving 60% AMI units for 60 years. One thing this does change by aligning all of our resources is we're actually getting more public value. You'll see that we're getting 99 years of affordability instead of 60 in the case of the SDC waivers or 20 years in case of the property tax exemptions. The third point I'd like to say about the policy assumptions that we received from Commissioner Salzman at the very outset of this offer is that we very much wanted to prioritize units on site over the receipt of a fee in lieu. I've administered programs elsewhere, and my experience is, as David says, if I receive a fee, I have to accumulate multiple fees for multiple units in order to create a fundable project. I, as a bureau director, then have to procure a site, often in competition with the private developer, paying market plus whatever price premium is attached at the time to that site. And it is often a lag of 3 to 5 years. So we are more inclined to try to tap the hydraulics of the private market, cause the units to be developed where they are most desirable, where the private investment dollars are invested in opportunity-rich areas, so that we are not compelled to look at accumulating the fee and spending it elsewhere.
And Kurt, the fee in lieu would go into the HIF?
The fee in lieu would actually be isolated in its own inclusionary offset fund. We think it's important because the Housing Investment Fund currently receives program income from the sale of other real estate assets, and we don't want to commingle those funds. So this would be isolated in its own inclusionary housing fund. That way the council auditor and any private auditor can track the receipt of those funds and the expenditure of those funds separately from other housing investments.
But as a practical matter, you could take the money, you have two pots of money that you can.
It could be layered.
You can layer to be working on projects as you're accumulating the resources.
Very true.
And can you tell me what would be the allowable uses of the fund?
Well, there needs to be a nexus between the payment of the funds and the use of the funds. The basic idea being that a private developer that is paying a fee in lieu needs to recognize that that was for the intended purpose of household, generally benefiting low and moderate income households. David, would you like
Just one clarification. I wouldn't characterize the fee in lieu, neither do the courts, as a nexus fee. So the payment of this fee is not subject to legal standards of nexus or reasonable relationship.
I didn't hear the answer to my question. What would be the allowable uses of the fund?
We currently only directly invest Housing Bureau resources for households under 60% of AMI. I don't see a particular reason why we would fund any households above 80% of AMI, but there may be a mixed income community where that would apply.
Let me try asking it in a different way.
Commissioner, in terms of the parameters of the fund, it would be identical to the Housing Investment Fund. The fund was actually created already when council chose to adopt the construction excise tax, and the income parameters and the programming parameters are identical to the Housing Investment Fund. We just wanted to split the resources for accounting purposes in separate city funds.
And when you come for the public hearing, I think that would be very helpful to have that noted on, have it in writing or on the PowerPoint. I think that's going to be a question that lots of people are going to be asking. Thank you.
Sure thing.
The continuing on with the policy assumptions, we wanted to apply an inclusionary housing requirement on buildings, every building over 20 units in size that was eligible, and that we wanted inclusionary units to be comparable in terms of the configuration, bedroom size, and composition of the other units in the building. In other words, we didn't want the affordable units to be all clustered into one particular portion of the building or economically isolated.
Speaking of size, one concern that I've heard voiced, I forget by who, frankly, in the past few weeks, is that right now the market is producing one-bedroom and studio apartments. So if we get our units within the existing market and existing projects, then we're not going to have units that are usable for families. So at some point, I'd like to hear some discussion of that issue.
I think it's perfectly appropriate, and some of the work that I did when I was still with OTAC for the Seattle City Council was to calibrate their property tax exemption to encourage and incentivize more family-sized units. That is a hybrid that we can experiment with as needed. What we can't really compel developers to build something that they're not building already anyway. And I think that's a practical reality. But if we're putting money into units over and above the inclusion, I think you can buy handicapped accessibility in proportions greater than the state minimum requirements. You can also buy larger units as a portion of your public investment in the project.
Okay, but that would envision a greater public investment than we're anticipating the subsidy here.
That's correct.
So again, I don't want to keep on coming back to this, but it seems one argument for having a viable fee in lieu is that you could use that money to make direct investments in larger units.
If
And the
I may-
last, I would like to, go ahead, David.
I was just going to say what a number of our client jurisdictions have done with regard to this concern, which is a frequent concern, that the bedroom count configuration of market-provided units is often smaller and less suitable for family-sized households, is compliance options are either skewed to incent the provision of larger bedroom count affordable units within the project, meaning there might be a lower unit count for larger bedroom mix, or your percent set aside might be counted by bedrooms, not by units, or might be counted by square footage, not by bedrooms or units. All of the developers are highly creative people. Also, I mean, there are just some sort of simple engineering standards about construction and multifamily housing where you want to stack bedrooms and kitchens and the plumbing and the power fixtures. So observing that design requirement up front in, say, discussions with the Housing Bureau, we have seen some flexibility. So it need not require more subsidy. Far from it. It could be achieved through some administrative flexibility in discussions between the developer applicant and the Bureau.
Yeah, I would love to see some thoughts on how this could look, the options like set aside being by bedroom rather than by unit.
That's actually quite common. And I may have mentioned in my intro, Cambridge, a recent client of ours, requires that for buildings of more than 50,000 square feet, 20% of the affordable units be 3-bedroom units. It's not even negotiable. It's just, and so knowing, developers crave certainty, and so knowing that developers will design from an engineering perspective and cost efficiencies, as I mentioned, accordingly.
The last public value I'd like to underscore that is embedded in this program design is permanent affordability. As a city, we've been incentivizing developers through property tax exemptions and fee waivers, but we've been getting temporary affordability. And I don't think any one of us wants to revisit the wave of mark-to-market units that could happen in the next 10 to 20 years as properties that we've currently are motivating through property tax incentives reach the end of their regulatory agreement. So embedded in all of our assumptions has been that we are going to buy longer-term affordability so that it becomes part of the social infrastructure of the city, not a temporary fix to our current housing needs.
As a practical matter, what happens if a building is demolished at 50 years or is destroyed in some natural disaster or whatever? How does the covenant? Our practice has been a 10-year affordability on the tax abatements, 60 years. Now we're in the 100-year range. What happens if that exceeds the lifespan of the building?
Well, of course, these are recorded deeds on the property and run with the land. The buildings themselves, as you say, may have a finite economic life, although everything that's being built in the central city is being built for a 100-year economic life and will likely last longer than that. If we have a regulatory lien on the property, we'll have to talk about it with the building owner and developer at the time that the building is replaced as to what is the remaining residual worth of that inclusion and what is the council policy at that moment in time going forward, because you may well have recalibrated, rechanged the program. I would expect that they would apply to whatever new policy exists, deducting whatever current obligation they have remaining. And there may be a cash out of that value at that moment in time. They have an insurance settlement. There could be a reconciliation of the value at that point in time.
The owner, let's say there's a fire, property's destroyed, there's an insurance settlement, the owner takes the settlement and wants nothing more to do with the property. Under this covenant, a recorded regulatory restriction on the land, not the building, the sale of the land would be conditioned on either replacement housing at the targeted income levels originally regulated, or there may be some negotiation provision on the sale of the land. But replacement of a structure on the land, and let's say a hotel is then replaced, then there would need to be some provision made for a payment, right?
So would then the burden be on the realtor who's doing the sale to highlight that this has got
Boy,
some...
that's a great question. We have seen lenders ignore recorded regulatory covenants and wreak havoc with asset management practices on a portfolio of assisted housing over time. And the city, in our opinion, we spend a lot of time on asset management, is well advised to be watchful year over year over year for compliance. It's not through malfeasance. It's often through just either not understanding or not looking. I'm not ascribing motive here, but to protect this asset long term requires some staff resources to watch the kitchen, as it were.
So I don't know if you're going to get into that later, but I am interested in the administrative cost moving forward. And then it does get back to my question at the beginning of, supposing the developer, whoever it might be, is not in the business of holding rental property, how does the breaks that the developer got in building it get passed on to the next owner? Or would the next owner have to charge higher than median for the non-affordable units in order to be able to continue to turn a property?
Any
profit?
any sale or transfer of the building under the covenants, which I think we're all contemplating here and have all worked with over decades of practice, would require any new owner to comply with the affordability restrictions on the restricted units.
Right, but then the new owner, developer's long gone. How then does the new owner factor in that they've got a certain number of units that they can get less from?
The value of the unit,
Adjusting their price on
Yeah.
what they pay for the project.
the value of the building is predicated on those obligations. And they're fully informed through the title report as to what those obligations are.
So currently, the Housing Bureau is responsible for reporting to council every year on compliance with all of our regulatory agreements. And we have a regular exercise of kicking people off programs if they're not. And that's actually become so routine, we do it mostly on consent. Once upon a time, it had a lot more drama. I assume, as part of our safeguard here, that you will be reviewing this annually and reporting to council if there are any projects that are not in compliance with our regulatory agreements as a further hedge about, future changes.
That is correct. We'll do it in the context of the state of housing, so you'll see it once a year. Just to move along, since we have some invited testimony, slide 7 describes what Commissioner Salzman's revised recommendation to you will be, and that is that we're going to stagger the implementation of this program in mixed-use zones by initially lowering the rate of inclusion and lowering the fee in lieu. This is very much a recognition of that gap that Nora described, the residual land value gap, being left somewhat uncovered in the mixed-use zones, and trying to be as responsive as possible to the Planning and Sustainability Commission's concern, which they elucidated in writing.
Before you go on with this, you've skipped slides 5 and 6 about parking. So could you please go into that and the cost of, and whether it's just the affordable units that don't have to have parking, or whether you may be...
I think we're going to cover parking later on page 10, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, slide 10. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew to click through the actual construct. And then we have a panel of 4 individuals, including 2 people from Planning and Sustainability and 2 people from the panel of experts.
And I'm lost. What page are you on in there?
Well, Matthew's migrating now
Slide
to
8.
slide 8, which is page 4.
So, given the concerns that were raised by the panel of experts and the Planning and Sustainability Commission, Commissioner Saltzman and the Housing Bureau have modified the recommendation, particularly in the mixed-use zones. And so I'd like to take some time and just go through the current proposal as is for the city overall, but also touch on the mixed-use zones and the changes that have occurred. And then I know we've got our invited testimony, and I know we've got a lot of questions and discussion. So moving to slide 9, while the original recommendation was an inclusion rate of 20% of units at 80% of the area median income, and 10% of the units at 60% of the area median income. Given the drop in residual land value, as mentioned by Nora and Kurt, the commissioner and the Housing Bureau have modified the recommendation to incorporate a 2-year phase-in. And so for, page 5.
Page 5, slide 9.
So the initial rate between now and the end of 2018 would be a 15% inclusion rate at 80% AMI and a 8% inclusion rate at 60% AMI. And then in 2019, the inclusion rate would increase to the original recommendation of 20% of units at 80% AMI and 10% of units at 60% AMI. Moving to slide 10, the incentives would be the density bonus, so any height and FAR bonus that were conceived under the mixed-use zones project. We haven't modified those recommendations. There was a lengthy community conversation with many individuals that had interest in the neighborhoods with respect to scale of buildings, and so we're not proposing to modify that density bonus, but to utilize it with the inclusionary housing program. There would be a 10-year property tax exemption on the affordable units, a construction excise tax exemption on the affordable units, a waiver of parking requirements when units are provided on-site, or if the units are provided off-site, which, as a reminder, would need to be provided within a half-mile radius. And then SDC waivers would be granted on the affordable units at 60% AMI and below.
So again, my question is, waiving parking for all the units or just for the affordable units?
For the building, if they had units, the entire building, if they had units on site.
And could you just give me an estimate of how much does a 25-unit building cost?
25-unit building cost to
Yeah,
build.
what would be the developer's cost to build it?
Well, I can reference it in our prototypes, and let me get that number to
Well,
you.
it's relating to parking because if the number we've been using in the other discussions is 50,000 for a parking spot.
Mhm.
So if you've got a 20-unit building, that's $1 million.
Yes.
So how does that relate to the overall cost of the building?
So in our modeling, we modeled in the mixed-use zones 4 different parking scenarios. One, which would be an on-grade parking scenario. One, which is a tuck under. One that is a underground, and one that was, Nora, what was the 4th? Podium. In the scenario, the cost increases as you go underground. And what we're estimating, and we'll see this when we move to feasibility for the mixed-use zones, we're going to talk through the feasibility, is that in the CM2 zone, which is the zone we're presenting here today to model feasibility, the value of exempting the parking requirement is about $30 per square foot of site area. And our models are modeled on a 20,000 square foot lot. And so you're talking about in the realm of $500,000 of exempted cost if you exempt the parking requirements for a typical CM2 development.
So on the, when do you expect to have a rough sketch of what the incentive would look like based on the council action last week, proposing to eliminate the parking minimum and link it to IZ?
In terms of the feasibility,
Just how that's incorporated in your proposal.
Well, what we thought we would do is provide a council memorandum at the end of today's meeting prior to the public hearing on the 8th, which will ball all this together so that you'll have a litany of different points supported by the research. So that'll be essentially an executive memorandum that David will transmit to the council.
Okay, and what I'll be looking for, Kurt, is in the context of what we decided last week, my hope is that that it takes a lot of pressure off the other incentives to have the parking minimum be linked to IZ, and because we've been told that it'll effectively apply to almost every project in the context of what we did with the amendment last week. So. Our hope is that it takes the pressure off the other subsidies that would otherwise have to be used. But I'd like to get a sense of how you view that.
Yeah.
But
We'll have it on the record for the hearing.
I mean, I thought that you're already assuming waiver of all parking requirements in your proposal here.
So, yes, to the question, it is. Yes, we have already assumed the waiver of parking requirements in the modified proposal when units are provided on-site or off-site in close proximity. And we're going to talk through the feasibility. So what the impact of that is on feasibility. And we worked on estimating those numbers with staff from the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. And if that's a direction council wants to move in, we are already working on the accompanying code that would be necessary to put it before council at the hearing and a possible vote.
On the issue of property tax exemptions, at some point are you going to talk about whether the exemptions you're talking about would run up against I think it's a $3 million a year cap we have on affordable housing property tax exemptions, that we need to get the cooperation of the county, et cetera, in order to move up?
So and when we get to the central city, I'll touch on the cap, the tax exemption cap issues.
By the way, just because I've been through this battle, you actually have to get the concurrence of the county commission and the county assessor. The county assessor has independent standing to approve or disapprove any tax abatement, which makes it a little more complicated.
Presumably, we have to get the school districts to agree too, right?
Yes, they have to agree also, school district.
So turning to slide 11, what you'll see there is the modified fee in lieu schedule on a per gross square foot basis for the mixed use zones. And again, this is taking into consideration the idea of phasing in the fee in lieu. Just very quickly, the original fee in lieu was calculated based on, Commissioner Novick, to your point, the amount of revenue that would be needed for the city to acquire land and produce the unit offsite. So that if a developer was choosing to not have affordable units in their building, the fee schedule was established so that the city could build the same number of units, albeit with the time delay that both David and Kurt mentioned.
And how does that translate into the building that we'd have to build? Yeah.
It's so the subsidy that we modeled this on is it takes the city on average about $100,000 of subsidy per affordable unit to acquire the land and build the unit itself. And so depending on the number of affordable units in the building, the fee per gross square foot is roughly equivalent to $100,000 per affordable unit they would have otherwise provided on site.
But that's usually much less than we usually have to pay to build affordable units.
Correct. We modeled it based on the average city subsidy. If we wanted to model it based on the true cost, the fee would be about 3 times as much.
And why did you choose not to do that?
We chose to do that because we were looking at the price to the city of Portland itself in order to finance the development and construction of affordable units off-site that often will use bank financing or tax credits to leverage the city subsidy in order to produce the unit.
We could actually build at 100,000.
Correct.
Assuming that low-income housing tax credits and tax-exempt bonds are used in the replacement housing capital stack, this would essentially supplant those other resources, as we currently do.
I haven't seen in any of the projects that have come through that we've been able to build for $100,000.
We're underwriting projects at that level today now, and the NOFA that was released this April included 8 new projects that met that standard.
I think it might be worthwhile when we have the public hearing to do a 10-minute primer on the various tools we use to build affordable housing, because in this current debate between cost and value, and I have found this debate relatively disheartening because it's so fact-free, what happens is people cherry-pick numbers and use that against us. And the fact is that if you assume the whole package of subsidies, then you get a bigger number. If you're looking at the city's contribution versus equity contributions and other tax credits and whatever, it's a different picture. That gets lost sometimes in this debate. I think it's also lost on some of the narrative we see in the press. And so I think going back to sort of how we finance and what our toolkit is and what is our investment versus the leverage of other tools. Now, it's true, technically speaking, that you add up all the public subsidies from every source, and that does come from a taxpayer. But I think what gets lost is that our contribution is often a much smaller percentage, and that, I think, is what we should be debating. What is our contribution, not necessarily the merits of a federal program that requires, that subsidizes through tax credits or something else, or a state program. Again, that's a nuance that gets lost, and I think a primer at the public hearing just on how we finance and the range of investments we make depending on the project, I think helps set that conversation.
That's very helpful. As part of that, I think we do need to discuss what's going to happen at the federal level, because certainly some of the candidates were saying they were completely going to get rid of the Housing and Urban Development Department.
Well, there's one piece of good news, which is, and we know this from Senator Wyden and his team, the Republican senators who have influence like the low-income tax credit program, they like the Section 8 program, they like the market-based programs. Now, those programs are also have great inefficiencies, and one of the reasons our costs go up in some of these projects is the costs associated with administering tax credit programs. But the Republicans do like those programs, so at least we have a fighting chance on those. Other kinds of subsidies, who knows?
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
I was just going to comment that in many jurisdictions, the city council will debate the question of whether the gap should be calibrated on the city share or the total gap made up by all sources. Put another way, developers, again, who are quite skilled and creative, could use the 4% low-income housing tax credit and the private activity tax exempt bond program, which will be more advantageous as interest rates continue to rise, to help defray their own costs of compliance. And none of that was modeled by us. So I think this debate is very real. I think the optics of it, if you will, which is I think what you're referring to, Commissioner, is very real. What might be helpful is in the work Nora and the panel of experts has done, you have some very real numbers on 2016 development costs by all types of residential prototypes, and you can contrast those to what the Bureau's projects are producing, and my guess is you'll find great comparability by product type, by prototype, if you will.
Moving to slide 12, at the bottom of page 6, what you see here is the mixed-use zones feasibility. And as we've referenced before, this is calculated based on what's called a residual land value analysis. And essentially, for folks who are unfamiliar with residual land value analysis, you can think of it as after taking into consideration the cost of developing the building itself and the required profit for a developer and the investors of capital and debt, the amount of money a developer would be willing to pay for a price of land and still build the building. So what you see on the left is a market rate building, and for this prototype, again, this is the CM2 zone, which is where we expect most development in the mixed-use zones over the next 19 years from now until 2035. And through the feasibility analysis and the panel process of informing the development of prototypes to do the economic study, we found that on average at market, a developer would be willing to pay $70 per square foot of site area of land and still build a building based on construction costs and required rates of return. The middle column you see is the modified recommendation from Commissioner Saltzman, which is 15% of units at 80% AMI until 2019. And with the reduction in revenue due to affordable rents in the building, you see that residual land value drop to $40. And so a developer would be willing to pay no more than $40-something for land if they wanted to preserve, again, the same profitability and they had the same cost of construction.
What assumption did you make about profitability?
Nora, can you speak a little bit about profitability assumptions?
Because we were told in a previous work session that it's generally between 8 and 15%. So I'm just wondering what number were these figures calculated on? And again, does this build in long-term profitability? And it's at what level for the new owner?
Well, when you do a land residual analysis, you're looking at a particular point in time, and it capitalizes the net operating income of the building. So that does look at the profitability over the course of the life of the building. We also did IRR analysis, internal rate of return analysis, which is a cash flow analysis for 20 years, looking at the effect of when the property tax exemption dropped off, because we wanted to see, and we saw that that did not have a large impact on the IRR. I was looking for I'm trying to remember the return because we used several.
There's
Okay, let me find it.
Okay. The challenge is for each development prototype, we've got 6 different scenarios, 6 different cost points, and 2 different return rates. And so we looked at them and then did our best to match them to what we see happening in the market. And so what you see here, and then similarly for the modified 60%, the deeper affordability option, you see that the residual land value analysis would yield a roughly $60 per square foot of site area price of land that a developer would be willing to pay if they wanted to, again, retain the same return and they had the same development cost. And so working with staff from the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, we modeled what, on a per square foot of land basis, the value of exempting the parking requirements would be. And I think this may speak to some earlier questions. And it's about $30 per square foot. And another way to think of it is that regardless of what the market may develop, the parking requirements that are in the current zoning code impose a $30 per square foot of site area cost with respect to parking.
Is that regardless of whether it's a 20-unit development or a 120-unit?
So we assumed for each of our prototypes that the building would be as large as feasibly possible within the height and setback and step back and zoning regulations.
The cost of parking remains constant.
Unless it triggers like underground parking. But I believe in the CM2, we're looking at tuck under parking.
When we did the parking regulations in the last administration, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability had did some similar things and came up with the same answer.
So the returns we assumed was 25% of development costs, and that included on the land as well. So we backed out 25% return on the development hard costs and 25% on the land cost as well, and backing into the residual land
all
value.
these numbers are built on the developer getting 25% profit from the construction.
Well, yeah, depending on your definition of profit, but yes, this is a 25% return on cost.
And why did you choose that?
That was in conversation with the panel of experts and the feeling that that's a minimum for given the level of risk of the types of developments that we're talking about here.
So in other words, if it was lower than that, your expectation is that people would just build less? Or do so, or elsewhere?
Yeah, they'd look to where they could get the highest return of comparable investment opportunities.
So again, looking at the concerns that were raised by the panel of experts as well as the members of the Planning and Sustainability Commission, we feel that adjusting the inclusion rate for a 2-year period of time and the addition of the exemption of parking requirements does provide a pathway for a developer to either return to the residual land value of a market rate building or choose to modify some amount of parking or construction cost and still move forward with a development project in the mixed-use zones.
So on the issue of the ramp up, we got a document from something called Oregon Locus, Responsible Real Estate Developers and Investors, that argued for a much slower ramp up. They said that we should start with a 3% inclusion rate for mixed-use zones and a 10% inclusion rate for zones with base FAR above 5.0 and gradually ramp up. And they made some reference to a ramp-up period, longer ramp-up period is important to give predictability and prevent investor jitters. And I recall seeing Joe Courtwright, local economist, say something about the desirability of a longer ramp-up time in some comment he made recently. Could you address, why you think that their arguments for a longer ramp-up period are misguided and why you think that this would work?
Well, working with planning and sustainability and the Bureau of Development Services, we've been looking at which projects and at what rate projects are becoming vested. and we're seeing about a 300% increase in permit flow. So by February 1st, the projected effective date of this new policy, you'll have over a 3-year supply of product already vested under the old rules. So in effect, we're already, by virtue of having an open, transparent, deliberative process, we're already giving people fair notice and warning, and they have themselves created their own ramp-up period. During that period of time, we'll do an evaluation of the calibration at year 2, and that'll take into account those vested projects proceeding, since they have 3 years in which to pull their permits. So I think,
Could you just, excuse me, just share with everybody what you told me the number was? No, I mean,
It's
3
about
years ago.
16,000.
16,000 permits have been applied for at this point, or
Right.
at least a pre-app.
So the last 2 years, so in 2014 and 2015, the city saw about 4,500 to 5,000 multifamily permits. And at last check, which was the beginning of November, I think it was we pulled the data the week before the election, there were 14,000 unique multifamily units in the pipeline. And it's because there's both the permitting application process and the land use review process. So it's, close to 300% the normal volume, and we anticipate more units moving through the process before February 1.
David, if we adopt this policy and make it retroactive a year, any legal issues that you can think of?
I haven't studied Oregon law in this matter. I think the issue, to answer your question of ramp up, is a political issue, not an economic issue. I think it's really a matter of the policy agreement that a city council among its colleagues makes, among yourselves, frankly, and with the stakeholders to whom you're accountable. Put another way, a real estate attorney, highly, deeply experienced attorney in New York City, one of the most complex zoning environments imaginable, once told me that when the New York City Planning Commission adopts an action at 2 a.m., land values adjust by 2:01.
The New York Minute, in other words?
Yeah, that was a New York minute. We've seen that. I used the phrase certainty before, and I do think certainty is a value in a development context. So to the extent, lack of certainty injects risk. So when you're clear on the rules, you're taking away a fair amount of risk. And by remaining clear and consistent, and that's why this is so important to embed in the zoning code, right? And hopefully this will be long-term policy, given your vision, Commissioner, for the city as a place of economic integration for all to live, work, and go to school, would be stable. To continually change the rules would inject a lot of risk and uncertainty in the marketplace.
Well, to that point, to return again to the question of the cap on tax exemptions, if we adopt a policy that in effect assumes that the cap on tax exemptions is going to be lifted to a certain level before we have agreement from the county and the school districts, it seems that that would inject a significant amount of uncertainty.
So we've looked at what we would estimate the need for the full tax exemption to be. I know that the commissioner has had a discussion with Chair Kafori. Our estimate is $4.2 million per year, particularly in the initial years. What we see currently in our multi-program is about 1/3 of the tax exemption approvals that move through City Council are not subject to the cap. Because part of the agreement with the county is that if a tax exemption is approved in an urban renewal area, it doesn't apply to the $3 million cap. So even if we were to talk about full utilization of our voluntary program now, while the cap is set at $3 million, it would get close to 4 or 4.5 million, depending on the location of the building.
You said in the initial years, does it go up in the out years?
Well, at some point you're going to need to take into consideration the urban renewal areas going away. And I think the urban renewal areas will officially expire and the debt will be repaid in the mid-2020s. So at that point, we would no longer have the scenario where a tax exemption approved in an urban renewal area doesn't apply to a cap that's agreed to by the jurisdictions.
David and Nora, what are your thoughts about that? If we think that we have room over the next few years with the $3 million, but then when the urban renewal areas expire in the early 2020s, then it'll be unclear whether we continue with the tax exemption. Is that something we should worry about or not?
I guess my answer is the market will adjust to a range of changing circumstances, like the cost of money. If it's the policy of the Portland City Council to entirely offset a calculated economic effect at a point in time, then it would almost obligate you to recalibrate that annually, which, taken with my earlier comment, would frankly inject a lot of uncertainty, would be politically hugely painful for the city council and your successors, and probably wouldn't be good public policy. You'd be attempting to guess where markets are going based on lots of variables that get injected. As I said in my introduction, we've never encountered a jurisdiction in our practice that sought, as a matter of policy, to offset 100% of the effect, but rather to provide developers a kit of tools, and they can root around in those tools. In some cases, parking may be really material. In other cases, developers want the parking because it's a marketing issue for the market they're trying to aim at, and they fight the city to get more parking, frankly. And we've seen that often. So what might be deemed good public policy might not make good market sense for a market rate residential developer. So I think my bottom line advice to you is not to attempt to finally calibrate a point in time in a marketplace that by definition is dynamic. And when you look at the price swings in land in Portland is, I would characterize, hugely volatile. I think it's a fool's errand for you to attempt to guess. And I'm certainly not going to advise you to guess that. I'm not going to guess where things are going to be 2, 3, 4 years from now.
And with respect to certainty, in the code and rule, so we're going to be bringing forth a number of updates to city code in Title 30 and Title 33, and an administrative rule in some of the tax code where our multi-program resides. And in there, it spells out the required rates of inclusion or deeper affordability options. It also spells out the incentives that are offered, approved by City Council in exchange. And there is a provision that says, should the city not have the available incentive as defined in code, a developer is not subject to the inclusionary requirement to provide that level of certainty.
Is it intended eventually for this to be the only program to incentive multifamily development, or any of the other things that we currently have going to continue, and potentially we have to look at double dipping or how it factors in?
We've designed this to align all of our programs together to reach maximum public benefit effect. So the only exception to that is that during this interregnum period where we have this big bubble of some 16,000 units that would otherwise be producing market rate housing at 3 times the current rate, we think that a lot of those will actually become voluntary 60% units because, for one, we don't think lenders are likely to finance all those units under current terms and conditions, that they'll have to be repriced given higher rates of interest. So we think that there will be some voluntary utilization of the program for this interim period of time. We want to make sure that we're flexible enough to respond to that demand.
I mean, again, in the spirit of giving you some context of 25 years of practice in lots of different markets, I don't think we've ever seen this type of rush to permit. Anywhere near. I mean, I was shocked when I heard this number. So I think that does speak to Kurt's point that the market is already pricing in a ramp up. And I think it also speaks to the inability to guess, where markets will go. We did a very comparable analysis, the most extensive in U.S. history at the time it was done for LA. And at that point, no type 1 high-rise construction in LA was feasible, and we recommended against it. And within 18 months, tens of thousands of units of high-rise construction have been permitted because there was a slight shift in the demand economics of price. One thing we haven't emphasized here is this, and I don't want to be overly, suggest over-precision here because I think, again, that's a bit of a fool's errand. But the land residual model is highly sensitive to inputs. And so you change rent or sale pricing a little bit, and you get wide swings. Witness the LA example. There had been no type 1 construction for 20 years in LA. And overnight, literally, that market flipped. So I don't think we as economists and you as a sitting council are able to predict that, those types of swings.
On the issue of the tax exemption, I just want to flag that we got a memo from the city budget office yesterday saying that they estimate the cost of this proposal to the city general fund that grows from roughly $660,000 a year to $6.1 million a year. I assume that referred to lost property taxes primarily, although they didn't say that. So I'd somewhat like some clarification from CBO and from housing as to how to reconcile the assumption that 4.2 million will be enough with their assertion that 6.1 million in city general fund is going to be lost.
After, I know we're going to get into some time crunch here because you've got a couple of panels, but I see Andrew Scott's here, so I assume we're going to invite Andrew up at some point just to talk about his memo. Kurt? Well, I would like to.
We will respond to the memo in preparation for the December 8th.
Okay, but we had a work session yesterday where we were pretty flexible. I think as long as Andrew's here, I would like to give him an opportunity to come up because I have some questions.
So continuing to move through the presentation, in the central cities, slide 13, the recommendations have not been modified. The recommendation is that 20% of units at 80% of the area median income would be the mandatory inclusionary requirement, with a deeper affordability option of 10% of units at 60% AMI.
Could you tell me what does this map show? Because I can't read any of it.
Oh, it's a map of the central city boundary.
Why is one of it shaded and one of it not?
So one is zoning and one is FAR.
Oh, thank you.
And so the incentives that would be provided would be the density bonus. Currently, that was being conceptually put together as a part of the updates to the Central City density bonus updates around trying to incentivize affordable units on a voluntary basis. A 10-year property tax exemption on the affordable units, but in the case where the base FAR is 5.0 or greater, which is the most likely scenario that would lead to steel and concrete construction, we would utilize the full tax exemption program, so a tax exemption on all residential units. The construction excise tax exemption would be levied on the affordable units, as well as a STC waivers on the affordable units below 60% AMI. On slide 16, you'll find the fee in lieu schedule. Again, the fee in lieu was calculated to net the city the amount of revenue it would take to build the same number of units that would have otherwise been provided on site should a developer have chosen to provide those units. And you'll see that it ranges between $27 and $30 per gross square foot. And again, that's based on the $100,000 per unit subsidy that the city traditionally provides for the acquisition of land and the development of affordable units, with the understanding that nonprofit and for-profit developers that use our direct financing program leverage that $100,000 to get other sources of funds.
On the SDC waivers, I just want to flag, actually, should have asked for this earlier, but PBOT did a quick estimate that they based on the CBO assumption of 382 affordable units per year, we'd see $770,000 per year of lost transportation SDC revenue. And I assume that Commissioner Fritz has asked the same question of parks, and we need to factor those into.
Yeah, it's several million for parks, and that is of concern because of these are the very units that really need parks facilities close to them, and we're not yet where we have the whole city covered.
No, certainly. I think the one comment I would have there, and I think it's definitely something we can look at and model, and we'll work with CBO to provide numbers at the hearing, is that the current city's SDC waiver policy is a policy that's in place regardless of the source of the unit. So whether we used the bond money that was just passed or construction excise tax funds or urban renewal funds, the SDC waiver program doesn't discriminate based on the source of the affordable unit. And so if with the 10,000 unit production target that the Housing Bureau is trying to meet in the comp plan, if those units are 60% and below and the SDC waiver policy still exists per city council, then those revenue losses would still be there.
I think, though, we do need to have the policy question because, as we all know, both transportation and parks are greatly underfunded. And so since this is now going to be the norm rather than just the exception, that's proportionally a greater impact.
Certainly.
Well, I don't want to overly complicate this, but the impact on parks and transportation has a budget impact. The impact on the utilities may have a legal impact, so we have to also focus on both of those questions.
So then finally, looking at slide 17, what we see there is the feasibility analysis for specifically the 6.0 FAR Central City prototype. And so this is right where you would start to see buildings using the steel and concrete construction, and thus the incentive package would incorporate the full tax exemption on all residential units. And so you see there actually that with the use of the full tax exemption, the residual land value at the 20% at 80% AMI and the 10% at 60% could be higher than the market rate scenario. And this again depends on construction costs and returns. And as a side comment, I think we also see this validated through the significant uptick in the utilization of our voluntary multi-program in the Central City. I think we're finding that given the current market reality, that this is a very attractive option.
Be very helpful to me at the hearing or before to get just an example project that would cost X dollars. What does it cost now? What's the developer's profit then? And what's the developer's profit under each of these scenarios?
Certainly.
At this point, we'd like to invite additional people to testify. We have Dr. Lisa Bates, who served on the panel of experts, Maggie Talmadge, who was on the panel of experts and also was a member of the Planning and Sustainability Commission, Sarah Zahn, who was on the panel of experts, thank you, and Catherine Schultz, who is the chair of the Planning and Sustainability Commission. So if you can all come on up. Maybe one of you can grab the seat at the end there. So Dr. Bates, we'll start with you and press the button at the base of the microphone.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. As Commissioner Saltzman mentioned, I've been on the panel of experts during this process. My placement there, I believe, is related to my expertise in housing economics and housing policy, and not bringing that perspective. I think we've heard already about inclusionary zoning as a policy nationwide, but I'll just reiterate that certainly for myself, given the reputation of Oregon and Portland in particular for excellent planning and coordination of thinking about things like land use, transportation, and housing, that it was quite surprising to me upon arrival here that this tool, which is not only very widespread, but is considered a best practice nationwide for the provision of affordable housing, was not available. And I think that there are, because of that preemption by the state, there is, somewhat less experience or perhaps knowledge about the potential and the practices around inclusionary zoning here in this region. But again, I would reiterate, it's not only quite standard, but is considered best practice as a highly flexible tool with many possible implementation mechanisms. That occurs across a wide variety of markets and has been used for as long as the urban growth boundary has been around, 40 years plus. And our very best economic research demonstrates that inclusionary zoning is not only effective at creating an affordable housing supply that is integrated into areas of opportunity, but that it's most effective when it's mandatory, and that it does not have significant impacts on overall supply or prices in the market. And I think that is important to understand that is what the broad research shows, again, across many market conditions and across a long period of time, across many business cycles. We spent quite a bit of time in the panel of experts, and maybe I'll just say a little bit more about what we did there, looking at the calibration of this policy. And I think David and Nora gave you the broad sweep of that and the explanation of looking at types of developments. I think that process has been actually much more thorough than is typical for thinking about our regulatory environment as it is and changes to our regulatory environment, right? All planning and zoning regulations affect the cost of development. How we understand those and think about how changing those affects cost of development and impacts on those, is a project to do. So we started from what I think you've heard are actually quite conservative assumptions in terms of returns to developers and in terms of using prototypes and financial calibration that came from the development community via Eco Northwest. And those numbers, of course, it's not a crystal ball, right? We don't have perfect foresight into what happens in the market as the market changes. We don't have perfect foresight into how every development works. But in the belief that, businesses in the private market adapt and adjust their practices to regulations all the time, that we saw a way to calibrate a policy that would work in the development environment that we have. We have seen multiple versions of pro forma, multiple versions of development prototypes, both from DRA's analysis, but also brought forward by the developer group of Locus. And we were able to look at a live version of that spreadsheet in the meeting and see that be clicked through quite a bit. And I think what we could see from that is that that sample that was chosen by that group of developers to display to us has a widely variable set of costs and conditions that within the bounds of which the upper and lower bounds of any particular parameter lies a great gulf of possibility. So, trying to be, I think, as transparent as possible for choosing the numbers, looking at a reasonable set of assumptions, and looking at multiple metrics of success for development, which I think is realistic to how development works, and sort of norming that again against this long experience and across many jurisdictions that the analysis team has looked at, that we can reasonably, I believe, move forward with the proposal that the Bureau is putting forward, particularly, again, given this long ramp-up period that we have. So I'll just close by, reiterating again that this policy, while new to us here, is not new in the world, that we see the alignment, I think, of this policy with values that we hold in our city for how we provide housing across a wide spectrum of people, that if you work here, you should be able to live here. That as our neighbors who are contributing here in the city, whether they're teachers, they're nurses, they're our staff and students at Portland State, who are in the 60 to 80% AMI range, who are increasingly being squeezed out of the city, that we have a tool that can not only make additional units available, but ensure that they are available, integrated into all areas of our city. Certainly, as we talk about Northeast Portland, and I sit on the North-Northeast Strategy Advisory Commission, there is a lot of regret about the inability to have utilized a policy like this as we saw the significant new construction happening in Northeast Portland, and to think about the number of units that could have been created with a policy that, again, is very standard and almost a sort of course best practice nationwide in the housing policy circles. So I think this is the right time to move this forward and sort of to pick up this opportunity that we have right now.
Thank you, Dr. Bates.
Dr. Bates, could I ask a couple questions? One is, you've looked at a lot of other jurisdictions. Can you say that this proposal is most similar to X jurisdiction in the rest of the country?
No, and I would say because, well, for one thing, it's, it's 500 plus jurisdictions, each of which has a slightly different version of the policy. But also because of the particular sideboards that were placed by the state legislature, that this is a little bit unique in the way that, there's sort of these pieces that must go together.
And I'm cheating and asking this question, but since you're here, we're considering the question of whether to allow for more middle density housing in what are now single family zones. I'm just curious as to whether you think that we should take a broad view or a narrow view of in what areas middle housing should be allowed.
Well, I would take a broad view of areas in which middle housing are allowed, and I think that's one of a number of sort of planks in the platform of housing policy to allow for multiple housing types in single family zones. Is not going to resolve all housing problems. To have inclusionary zoning is not going to resolve all housing problems, but combining many planks is the reality of where we are in housing policy in our nation. We don't have a national housing policy that is meant to, we don't actually have the intent to create affordable housing for all people. We don't do that. And so we do what we can with the planks and the tools that we have. For me, the connection to the conversation about middle housing is that the report from the development community is if we relax single family zoning restrictions, we will stop all housing supply. Just as a reaction from some members of the development community is if we have inclusionary housing, we will stop all housing supply. And I think that's a reaction that is around change, right? So when regulations change, business practices have to change. Other development firms may be better suited to come into the area and do development. Some may be less well suited to do this kind of development. That happens when we change the regulatory environment, but the research does not bear out that it creates significant impacts on overall housing availability.
Thank you for inviting me here today. Likewise, I was on the panel of experts, partially with my role on the Planning and Sustainability Commission, but I believe partly because of my role at the Coalition of Communities of Color and the perspective that I bring from a community of color perspective. So I know Catherine is going to get into quite a bit of the letter from the Planning and Sustainability Commission, so I won't go too much into depth on that. Instead, I'll focus a little more on my experience on the panel of experts and the perspective I brought there. So obviously we've all heard that IZ can be done. It's been done across hundreds of jurisdictions across this country. We can look at many reports, including inclusionary housing, creating and maintaining equitable communities, which was in the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. And during the panel, we also established some policy goals based on some unique aspects of IZ, including the ability to get units on site and quickly and to capitalize and leverage private capital. And at the same time, promoting economic integration and affirmatively furthering fair housing, which was something as my role at the coalition, I'm very, very interested in. And as a resident of Portland, very interested in. And again, the program—
Maggie, based on what you just so eloquently said, I assume that you would agree with the idea that has been spoken by Kurt and others, that our preference should be to get the units in new construction, and that should be a preference over the fee in lieu.
Correct. I think although there is a good balance of having the fee in lieu dollars target 60%, we do want the units built on site. There is a value to time, and I think that's lost if we build 4 or 5 years later. And I think also, that the program can be calibrated across different jurisdictions, across different markets, across different geographies and neighborhoods, and I think that's a strength of the program. And again, Lisa talked about how much time we put into the panel of experts working since the legislative session, but of course, we've had community members, the city of Portland, working on this policy to repeal the ban on inclusionary zoning for years. And it's a tool that our community members brought to the city. They fought hard for this. And legislators, housing advocates, the development community negotiated over an agreement that they could all live with, which included very generous sideboards for the development community. Again, we've heard it's not very common to have such large offsets for an inclusionary program. And again, it was a program that was designed and negotiated so that it wouldn't dampen housing supply and that it would provide the opportunity for increased number of units affordable to 80 and 60% MFI. So we've gone through the negotiation in Salem. I think what I struggled to go back on, both on the panel of experts as well as on the PSC, is moving backwards. Really on those sideboards we already set. And we've gone through or gone around and round and round on the numbers during the panel of experts, and I think we heard quite well that these numbers aren't perfect. Folks will argue that we need to get the numbers perfect, but they never will be. The market changes. We're always going to have different data. And I think that is the strength of the recalibration, is that we can adjust and land values will too. And developers can figure out how to leverage other tax credits to work their pro forma. And we've also heard that land prices, residual land value across the city, and even in the same neighborhood, are widely different, and that there's really increased bidding and upbidding of land, and IZ is not going to affect that speculation. That's going to occur regardless. And I think the proposal we see in front of us today, it reflects a lot of the conversations we had at the panel of experts and at the Planning and Sustainability Commission. We saw that there were increased incentives in the central city, which makes sense given the cost of land and development, particularly given a lot of the heights. But the mixed-use zone was more questionable. And I think the proposal we see in here of a phased-in inclusion rate gets at that concern. But we can also go back again and say we've got 16,000 units in the pipeline. We have a phased-in process already, right? We've got 3 years for development and land values to adjust. So I think one of the biggest points is, so the PSC voted to hold the development community and developers harmless. I almost voted down the proposal. I struggled to, I guess, not to have developers not pay their fair share, right? And that it may be profitable. We discussed what if we give too many incentives? What if we directly subsidize, and this is more profitable than market rate? Well, let's just claw that back. And I'm thinking, is that reasonable? Is it reasonable or realistic to claw back and adjust subsidies in a year, in 2 years? Again, it goes back to, we haven't seen fully offsetting public policies like this here. We haven't seen fully subsidizing green building or public spaces requirements or bike racks or SDCs. So why are we doing it for affordable housing? That's what go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify, make sure I'm understanding. You did the numbers, and it's basically the developer's profit at 25% stays with all of these subsidies.
The proposal from the PSC was to entirely hold developers harmless so that there would be no feasibility gap. Even though we even heard from Locus and developers on the panel of experts that they could take at least a 10 to 20 basis point hit. But the PSC proposal went further and made sure that there was zero feasibility gap.
What was the rationale for that?
I'll go ahead and clarify that. And I can either do it now or when in my talking points. It's up to you. Okay. Perfect.
Great. And I'm fearful, and I think we heard this across the PSC as well, if we do increase, if we do have an incentive package that fully funds any feasibility gap, where will those resources come from? Will that eat into programs that serve households at 30% MFI or below? Is that a policy precedent we want to set? And I think finally, I think we need to remember why we're doing this, right? We went to the legislature, we repealed the ban, we've worked on the panel of experts, it's gone through the PSC, City Council has supported the pursuit of this at the state level because our communities need affordable housing. I believe 60% of the city is rent burdened. And that's not just 0 to 30, it's not just 0 to 60, it's across the gamut. And frankly, after November, our city council has a greater responsibility to protect our communities, particularly low-income communities, communities of color, and middle-income communities. We're not going to see favorable policies from the federal level, and it's that much more important that our city council and our state government looks after the interests and needs of our most vulnerable communities, and not the profit margin of market rate or profit-driven industries. And we also need to see this policy in tandem with all the other policies we're addressing. We can't build affordable housing on the outskirts of town and then expect our low-income community members to drive very fuel-efficient vehicles into the central city for employment, thus undercutting our climate and transportation goals. We can't underpay the contractors that work on our housing and thus force those workers to move out of the city entirely. We have to look at the system holistically. And, in terms of parking minimums, for example, our communities are largely lower income communities. Increasingly, millennials are transit dependent. So reducing the need for or the requirement of parking would benefit and go in that direction. So thank you.
Thank you. We'll go with Catherine Schultz next, Chair of the Planning Sustainability.
Thank you. The PSC's deliberations were a reflection of our belief that we should enact an IZ policy for all of the reasons that Dr. Bates so beautifully articulated. But after listening to the testimony, which you'll get to hear as well, I'm sure, we had concerns about the proposal that was put before us. And the key to that in our deliberations was the premise that the cost to development from the program should not suppress development. We need developers to continue to build units to be able to actually put affordable units on the market. And if we cannot continue to entice or use developers as our partners, then the program will fail to not only bring on affordable units, but to meet all the other goals that we have, such as climate action, transportation, and our city growth policies. Just kind of as a side note, as an architect, I want to counter Kurt's comments a little bit here about developers making historical profits. I can give you multiple examples of projects that we're working on right now, multifamily housing projects, where we're seeing loans called in during construction because developers are not able to meet their financing, their project goals. They're running out of money. And a lot of this is due to higher construction costs, amongst other things. So while landowners may be making more due to the sale of their land prices going up, I think you need to be careful and understand that developers are not necessarily, and developers need to be our partners in this process.
I don't understand that. If all of this is built in with a 25% profit to the developer, how does that fit with what you just said?
I am not a development expert, so I'm going to let Sarah answer that for you, if you don't mind. But I think it's an excellent question. I can just see the ramifications of the projects we're working on. Kind of going back to the PSC did not have the confidence that the inclusion rates that are proposed had enough incentives to offset the cost of providing the affordable units. Therefore, we offered 9 recommendations in our letter, many of which the Housing Bureau has addressed, and I'm not going to review the ones that they've already addressed. I'm just going to focus on a few that were not addressed. Number one, we all strongly agreed that we should provide as many affordable units as possible, and that the program needs to be viable at both the 80-20 level as well as the 60-10 level. While we definitely wanted to incentivize 60-10, we think the program needs to make sense at 80-20 as well, and that needs to happen in both the central city and in the mixed-use zones equally, which they've addressed by lowering the inclusion rate in the mixed-use zones. We also felt the incentives needed to sufficiently offset the cost of producing the affordable units to avoid creating the unacceptable risk of reducing the overall rate of development. So this is somewhat going to answering the question you're asking of Maggie. We didn't have the benefit of time to do all of the analysis we were asking for and would have liked to have thoughtfully done. And therefore, we didn't feel that we could confidently provide a recommendation on how to set a policy around what that gap should reasonably be. We were hearing one thing from DRA, the Housing Bureau's expert, another thing from Eco Northwest, another thing from developers, and honestly felt it was somewhere in between perhaps, but couldn't feel like we could give you an answer to that. Additionally, there are many proposed zoning code changes that are going to add to the cost of development that are not taken into account in any of the analyses. So this is the changes that are coming through the mixed use zones and the Central City 2035 that we're deliberating on right now, that we feel many of these are important items that need to be addressed and included and thought through, yet may suffer or may not be able to be enacted because they're not looked at cohesively. Therefore, the majority, not all, and Maggie clarified she certainly was one that was opposed to this, we recommended closing that gap, and we just set it at fully funding as a place to start, to look at then ramping up or phasing the program in the future due to so many unknowns that we couldn't answer for you. I know the Housing Bureau rebutted in their letter fully funding the recommendation, as we advised, by stating that it required the city to set profitability and overhead standards, which would be unacceptable. I personally agree with that, but that wasn't the point. I think what we were trying to say is we would recommend closing the gap closer to a zero residual land value. It may or may not be in all cases, and then phasing in a higher cost to development as the program grows and developers kind of get used to how to implement it. So therefore, our recommendation was that the program kind of looked at first setting what that acceptable financial gap is. And maybe you all agree that it's DRA's 25%. Maybe you're going to, after you hear testimony from the development community, think it's more like 10%. Maybe you think it's closer to zero. But it needs to be, I think, that understand first, and from there identify all of the incentives that are on the table that can be offered up, which will then inform you as to what a reasonable inclusion rate is. Again, we're hoping you will fully fund it and find the incentives to provide what we're recommending as the inclusion rate at fully 80-20 and 60-10. I don't believe, personally, from reviewing Housing Bureau's proposal that's on the table today, that it kind of hits those standards quite yet. But of course, as the PSC did not deliberate on that. We also recommend that you do not adopt the inclusion rates into Title 33 until the incentive package in Title 30 is fully determined and fully funded, till you understand what the county is going to really do.
Now, I think we heard from the earlier presentation that Title 33 and 30 language is going to come back together. So when we have the follow-up, but I think that's a significant issue, and I believe it was addressed, but let's make sure we clarify that.
And I think I've heard everybody's agreeing to that. I don't think there's any debate on that. I think the key is making sure that the inclusion rates and the supporting incentives are calibrated and unified, that the tax exemption program is sufficient to meet the program needs, and that's fully understood and fully funded, and that the density bonuses are properly examined. I think you've heard some testimony, you probably read it, about historic districts maybe not being calibrated correctly, and we're concerned about that. Additionally, we recommended that the in lieu fee be used as an important relief valve when the program is out of calibration and as a phasing tool as we phase in the program. We're supportive of a lower fee, and they have Housing Bureau has proposed it for the mixed use zone, but we think we are also recommending that be lower in the central city as well as you phase in. And then lastly, as Commissioner Novak raised, we're concerned about the effects of the program on the creation of new family housing units. And we recommend that a study be undertaken to encourage the development of them so that more families have the option to live in our central city. I can attest to multiple projects that I've worked on where I've watched developers consciously reduce the size of units to 1 bedrooms and studios due to trying to fit into the multi-program as it's kind of crafted today. So I think we're taking a market rate situation that's already making it more expensive to build 2-bedroom units and bigger, and exacerbating it by some of the requirements that we're putting on the voluntary program, and I think it's only going to get exacerbated in the mandatory program. So I think we need to continue to look into that. I think that generally covers it.
Catherine, can I ask you a question? We get a lot of very thoughtful letters from your commission that we then take very seriously as part of our deliberations. And I don't think I've ever read a letter quite like this. And I want to take the temperature of how significant your concerns are, because a number of them I think we're going to resolve today, and a number you're sort of salting our debate. You're asking us to grapple with some things. I think that's very important. But when I got this letter, I went back and reread the first paragraph, because to me it could have just as easily be written by saying we turned down the proposal, but there is a path to getting to yes if these conditions are met. Instead, you said it's unanimous recommendation in favor with conditions, but again, I've never read a letter from you that had conditions of this magnitude as part of a yes recommendation. So am I reading between the lines correctly, or am I overreading that point?
No, I think it's correct. I think the commission grappled with, as I was saying, kind of what the right balance was here. We felt very strongly we did not have the time to do the proper work that we would have really liked to have done, and therefore you're seeing that in the letter. And I think some commissioners would have voted, as you say, just the opposite way, no, but here's some conditions. But I think there was no doubt about it, support that we wanted to send forward to you saying, we believe a program should happen. We're supportive of a program. We just weren't convinced that the program on the table in front of us was correct.
Well, and to your point about it needs to pencil out in order to be effective, I don't think anyone disagrees with that. I mean, the idea is not to set up a self-defeating policy. It is to hit the sweet spot where we get the development we want and the housing we want, and people don't have the excuse that they can't afford to do it. But where that line is what we're going to be discussing.
Absolutely.
I guess going forward, the one thing that I'll want to sort of follow up with the commission, and hopefully when we have our hearing, is of the 9 conditions, just having a sense of prioritization. I mean, you listed 9. I don't know whether they are from top to bottom or whether they're just all 9, but there might be some that you weight higher than others. And just having a sense of what are those that you think you consider essential to the success of the program, and what are sort of nice to have, and having a sense of the difference between the two. I won't put you on the spot now, but
Perfect. That's a great question.
But when you give someone 9 conditions, it's going to be helpful for me to understand which of those conditions are the most fundamental, And are we getting closer to meeting the concerns through our deliberations? So, fair enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Sarah?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm Sarah Zahn, and I work at Girding Edlin. I served on the panel of experts. I also serve as the chair of the Portland Housing Advisory Commission. So thank you for having me today. Just to give a little bit of context, I've been involved in the discussions about inclusionary housing since Portland Housing Bureau began really discussing this in earnest at the legislature last year. And all along, I and Girding Edlin have been supportive of lifting the ban to give cities another tool for affordable housing. So we think it's one of the important tools in the toolbox. I think for all the reasons that Lisa and Maggie have stated, we agree that it's a tool that can be really useful for cities and has been deployed effectively in other jurisdictions. In particular, we believe that inclusionary housing can be valuable if the policy encourages production. I think you heard from Kat some of their concerns that we share around some of the current sort of calibration issues that we see as we start to run some of the numbers. Above all, I think we need a flexible program that will encourage production and density. And so Girding Edlin has been working with the Locus Development Group, which is a number, I think over 15 developers in the Portland area, who are all in support of the fundamental policy of inclusionary housing, believe that it's a policy that encourages healthy communities, and want to be a partner with the city on developing equitable housing throughout the city. So in that vein, we spent a lot of time as a group sort of analyzing the various different policy, program and policy pieces of advice that have come out of Portland Housing Bureau, and some of the various, there's been a lot of different metrics that we've examined between the different zones and the different various offsets that have been suggested. And we've shared a lot of that information with PHB and with the Planning and Sustainability Commission. And I think overall, there's a lot about the recommendation from PHB that that has legs, that can work, that we feel will not stall production or create a huge flight by developers. But there are also some fundamental concerns, I think, that we still have about some of the recommendations, in particular around the mixed-use zone. And we've sort of heard a couple of times today that the mixed-use zones are one of the areas where I think we've grappled the most with how to find sort of that effective calibration. And we're still a little worried and haven't spent a lot of time yet with sort of the revised policy that came out today to really understand it, but are still concerned that the calibration there is not really where it needs to be. And I think in particular, I worry about, density goals and production, and then things like, meeting sustainability goals at the city and quality construction in some of these zones, and wondering whether we're going to really see impact to those other goals that the city has around, really high sustainability, high quality materials and construction means and methods, and whether we're going to start to compromise some of those goals as well if we are not sort of balancing our offsets effectively for some of those policies. I want to address a little bit Amanda's, Commissioner Fritz's question about the developer profit, because I think I'm not sure where the 25% comes from. I think that it's probably a combination of really what our economic investors are looking for from a project, as well as what a developer at the end of the day, gains from a project. And we sort of make our money from projects in a couple of ways. One is through a kind of overhead fee that we take, which tends to be about 3 to 5% of the hard and soft cost of a project, depending on the project size and sort of complexity. And that really pays our fees and costs as a developer of operating. And that's sort of a set fee that we build into our pro forma. And then above and beyond that, really our profit is largely calibrated on a preferred return, which is really and we bring in an economic investor, an investor, institutional investor or local investor to, really bring the equity. So we, put construction debt or typical debt on the property, maybe 50 to 60% of the cost of a project is financed with debt, and the other 40 to 50% is equity. And that equity comes from whether institutional investors or local investors, and they have a number of thresholds that they're looking for economically to make in a project. And so there's a number of different ways that they look at that. Some of it is cash on cash returns, which is basically what's the cash flow as a percentage of the cost to build. That's sort of an initial metric, and then it's a rate of return over a period of years of how long they intend to own, be in an ownership position in the project. And the developer is often a participant in that equity stack, typically not a huge participant, maybe 0 to 10%. And typically our return is sort of calibrated with that investor's return, and often is structured as a preferred return. So once the investor is getting a hurdle rate, a certain level of return that they're expecting in a project, the developer serves to profit. So really we're sort of taking some risk around, the project performing. And so that's really how we calibrate our, investment in the project. But a lot of what we're doing when we run a pro forma is really looking at our investors' requirements and what they're going to need from an economic perspective to invest in a project. And so I think a lot of, where we come from as we're looking at these numbers is really, are we achieving a project that's going to attract capital? And so, when we think about a pro forma where we're, reducing incomes, because we're reducing rents on a certain percentage of units, how do we, either recapture that back up to the level it needs to be at or close to that level? And I think that's what we're hearing about, is the full, kind of a question of, are we trying to achieve full abatement, full, return on that loss of income, or are we getting partly there, right? And I think our group has said, we're willing to take some level of responsibility toward that, maybe 5 to 10%. Planning and sustainability would like to get us all the way there, which is great. But I think, we've said we can accept some limited responsibility for this, but at some point our investor is going to choose to invest in a project elsewhere, or, not invest in Portland.
There's a difference
Yeah,
between the investor who's building and then the owner of the building long term, because Gerding Eaglen doesn't own things long term, right?
It varies project by project. We frequently will own a project for a number of years, and then there'll be a sale event at maybe 2 to 10 years where Gerding Eaglen and our investor no longer have an ownership stake in the project.
And what's to stop an owner just charging a bit more for the market rate, or even luxury, which I understand most of the apartments that have been built recently have been luxury level? Why wouldn't the owner ongoing charge everybody else more in order to cover the low fee, and then that's continuing to drive our average rental rate up?
I think that's I think that's one of the concerns in the market, certainly, is that we will have an unforeseen sort of impact on affordability. So we may obtain those 10 to 20% affordable units, but conversely, on the other side of the market, we're only building very luxury apartments. So we're missing that middle. And at some point, the market also has a cap on what people can pay, even in the luxury market. I mean, we're starting to see that happen now in our units, where we've achieved sort of full. I think that our rents are as high as they can go.
I think that this goes to the point that David Rosen made earlier, which is to imagine the scenario that you're talking about, which I understand that it makes intuitive sense, is to imagine that right now people are not already charging what the market will bear in terms of rents. That somehow through magnanimity, people are not charging market rents in their market units, and that there's like way more increase that could be pushed because of these affordable units.
I don't think we have seen that. I mean, we've just seen rents going up, 100%, 300% across the board. And I'm starting to get worried that we're guaranteeing the developer 25%, we're guaranteeing that the ongoing ownership continues to be profitable, and it seems to be all by city subsidy and also things like parking, which neighbours are concerned about, and eventually we're going to have to do something about that.
I would note that, and I'm not the expert, every year someone from Gertie Edlin comes and gives us a view, and whether it's Jill Sherman when we did the big look, and you, and I almost think, Dan, we should have an annual work session to invite a certified smart person from Gertie Edlin to come in and walk through a pro forma on development, because it's very complicated, but you and Jill have the gift of explaining it in terms that even I can understand. But what I think, to your point, we're seeing a bifurcated market. The growth in rents is at the lower and moderate incomes levels, and there's been, and that's impacting real people with a vengeance. We're seeing a softening at the top, and I only know that because I've been talking to a bunch of developers, and you're seeing now things like incentives. You're seeing an extra month rent. You're seeing other adjustments because there is a sense, and with the 15,000 in the pipeline, we may be getting to the point where we're overbuilding for that market, and we're building. Remember, the stuff that's been built over the last 4 years largely is in the luxury end. The affordable piece has been very small. If the rents on what we loosely call affordable are coming up, but at the luxury end where the market has been building, we're seeing a softening, and where you land here in terms of what's the right incentive to make sure we don't scare away investment and development is a hard question, because we can't predict what the market's going to be tomorrow. We don't know how many people are crying wolf. We have the experience of other communities where we don't have the same generous incentives and sideboards, and it still works. But if we don't get it right, I mean, from my point of view, if we don't get it right, then it's a self-defeating exercise. So that's where I land ultimately.
So, I'm sorry, Kat, that members of the Planning Commission didn't join us for more of the panel and experts meetings, because we really went through a very thorough conversation. I think a number of very revelatory things happened in those conversations, one of which was members of development industry saying things like, we know the market is softening, the bottom will fall out, we will blame inclusionary zoning, regardless of whether that's the reason why. So I think we have to be really careful in understanding, as an industry, it goes through business cycles. There are things that are happening, there are things that are changing. We go through a process, we create a policy, and we can do that based on our best understanding of the economic analysis and economic research that's happened here and in other places, and sort of move forward. It will be a long ramp-up period because of the development pipeline that exists right now. There is time for people to recalibrate their businesses, or for other firms to enter the market who can work under these particular regulatory conditions.
See, my assumption is that, yes, people are charging whatever the market will bear right now. So I'm not concerned that people are going to raise rents more than they otherwise would, personally, deliberately, because they have to build affordable units. It seems to me that the real concern is if we adopt policies that result in fewer units overall being built and fewer than the demand warrants, then you just see supply and demand resulting in the price of the limited number of units we're building being built. So it seems to me that's the question.
And I would just say that was exactly the concern of the PSC. You expressed it very eloquently. And and that might be true, but I don't. All I'm trying to say is that the PSC didn't feel they had the information to be able to advise otherwise.
Okay.
Sorry. No, it's good. Everyone can't talk at one time. I see her. That result is not borne out by the best economic research. And in the absence of a time machine, right, we don't have a time machine, so we can't say exactly what happens in the future. In the absence of that, the best economic research says that there is not an overall impact on housing supply from inclusionary policies. And in a market that is hot and a population that is growing, it's a little hard to imagine a complete shutdown of a development pipeline that exists, right, with some 15,000 units already ready to go.
I mean, you said that the research doesn't bear it out. I mean, I would assume there'd be some parameters on that. I mean, if we decided to mandate that 90% of units be affordable to below 60% MFI, then I would assume that would have it, inhibit supply somewhat.
That would be far outside the bounds of the varieties of inclusionary policies that exist in the world. So that would be an probably untested proposition, because we test what exists in the world. I understand that the Planning Commission heard some testimony around the research analysis, and I would describe that testimony as being less informed than it could have been, having read carefully the body of research here on these questions. The body of research does not show significant impacts on supply of housing from inclusionary policy.
So in light of that, Dr. Bates, do you think that this doesn't go far enough? Do you think that you could reasonably jack it up to 30% or something like that with the same level of incentives?
I think that, as described by David Rosen and Associates, that this is a level of incentive and a level of offset that is greater than is typical for inclusionary housing.
So is that a way of saying, yes, you think with these kind of incentives, we could have a higher inclusion rate?
I think there's a limit placed by the state legislature. I think there's been an analysis that, every step of this analysis, the DRA and Eco Northwest analysis, is based on prototypes from the numbers provided by development industry persons. The somewhat less transparent pro forma provided by the Locust Group is provided by people from the development industry, and that this proposal fits within the parameters of both of those things with a reasonable level of offset for the provision of inclusionary units.
This is really helpful. Did you look at in the research where is the tipping point? Excuse me. So if it's cost neutral now to the developer, how much more could we ask for that then would be cost neutral too?
I don't have a specific answer to that, but I can try to find out before the 8th.
I think one important piece to remember here is that, again, we're developers attracting capital to a market, and at some point, capital is going to go elsewhere. There's plenty of other markets in which, the large institutional investors who are coming to Portland and investing in our market right now, there are plenty of other options for them nationwide where they can put their money. And at some point, the downward pressures of the impact of an inclusionary policy without adequate offsets will move money elsewhere. And that is a concern, I think, that we can't forget.
Dan, can I do a time check and a process check?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we're at the point where we want to thank this panel.
Oh,
I'd like to call staff back up.
Okay, good. That's what I was going to
Yeah.
ask.
Thank you all. Thanks for your service on the panel of experts and the Planning and Sustainability Commission. Thank you. So I'd like to bring staff back up just to answer any further questions, get any further directions. I mean, my goal here was if there are changes to the recommended policy, I'd like to be able to present it in the form of a substitute on the 8th. So it's important to get your feedback now or in the ensuing week, because we already filed today, the December 8th, the package that was presented to you today.
Yeah, and I need to read through everything we've been given and think about it. I don't have it today.
Sure.
I've got a bunch of questions, and I just want to clarify some things. So, and you've already addressed a couple of them, but let's start with your intent in terms of bringing forward changes to Title 33 and Title 30. And could you restate what your goal is for December 8th?
So there are changes that have been filed for Title III and Title 30 through Mayor Hales and Commissioner Saltzman that will come to you simultaneously on December 8th.
Okay. And so just so I understand this, Title 33 is really where we address the land use issues. Title 30 is where we talk about implementation and some of the goals. If there's a fight here at some point, it'll be a legal challenge. It'll be under Title 33. Am I right on that?
Yes, but I might ask Lauren to clarify.
Don't think necessarily, right? Because we getting challenged on the SDCs and things.
Well, but that's the route you go to LUBA on if you had a dispute, I think. But so you're going to bring. It was an issue raised by the commission. It's something that was in the memo we got. So you're going to bring both together to us next Thursday. Is that correct?
Yes, we filed this morning after our testimony and everything is being provided to the clerk of the council. I would underscore that changes to Title 30, the housing statute, are ministerial, and we can more easily amend the calibration, which is intentionally structured that way, so that we're not subject to a LUBA appeal each and every time we change the offsets.
And Commissioner, if I might just piggy on what you just said, could I ask that what we just voted on last week in terms of the required parking going away, which I now understand means it goes away for everybody because it's not just the units that are affordable, it's the entire project. I'd like to vote on that again because I can't support that. I thought at the time that we were going to have much more time to look through it and to hear more people's testimony on it. I think since last week I've got probably 20, 30 comments on email. And so I would have hoped we would have had a more, well, I hope we will still have a robust discussion about, because that's one of the questions that we're being asked, right? Is that level of subsidy the right level?
I don't know what the protocol on that. I think it was a 4-1 vote, but I would take that up with the mayor. But let's go back to some of the things that we've discussed today. So one of the issues that Steve has raised and someone who's testified raised is about the cost. And so we do have a memo from Andrew Scott. And I guess, Dan, I'd like to have a deeper dive on that. And not now.
Yeah, we'll provide a detailed response to the budget office.
Yeah. And just by way of history, when 6 years ago or so, when we did the big look with the county around our tax abatement policies, we considered it as part of that package. You know, the county put a hard cap on $1 million. Subsequently, when we had the housing emergency and circumstances changed, Dan, you negotiated with Deborah a lifting of that cap to $3 million, which is a significant change from what used to be a hard cap of $1 million. We're now talking about a further raising of that cap, and that, of course, would require the county commission's approval plus the assessor. Plus, there are trade-offs. Depending on what we're funding, these are dollars that otherwise would go to fund other basic services. So, and David, you mentioned that certainty is very important. So if we're not sure about the mix of incentives and packages, we have to be as clear as we can, and then we're going to have a backup plan to substitute something in. I mean, the thing about a tax abatement is it's foregone revenue, and we like them for a lot of reasons, but a substitute for that is actually a direct subsidy rather than a foregone revenue. So there are different ways of getting there, but I want to get my arms around the cost. And it's not just to understand the cost. That's just good government. We want to know going in what the cost is, and I think I have a pretty good track record of being willing to, swing for the fences on that. It's at some point also looking at what are we buying. The crushing need in our community is 0 to 60, and I just want to make sure that the subsidies are going to where the need is, because those are dollars that could come from other pocket. And we keep being told that it's the full-time minimum wage worker, it's the older adult on fixed income, it's the working class family, it's the formerly homeless family. Those are the people that need our help. And so I want to make sure that our subsidies and our dollars are targeted to where the greatest need is.
Commissioner, this will be one of my last chances to respond to that, which I've heard you say many times. I actually perceive that there's a crushing need in our community for warehousing anywhere from like 0 to 200% of MFI, because the entire community, except the very wealthy, are struggling with high housing prices.
And the only thing I'll say, because I'm not, I've learned not to get into a debate with Steve on certain things, but I will say that the one thing we've learned in the last decade is that the cost of not addressing the most acute need swamps our systems in ways that having my daughter maybe double or triple up in an affordable apartment doesn't. I just want to once again remind that the reason we're looking increasingly upstream to prevent, and we're looking at ways, and we're looking at daylighting what the true costs are, the person who is struggling on the street or about to go on the street with a family, the cost of not providing that housing swamps the societal cost of not providing my daughter with her own studio. I mean, just in relative terms. And that doesn't take away from each individual's needs. But just from a government cost point of view, if we don't get a handle on where the greatest need is, we're going to be swamped with the cost of managing a failed system one way or another. And that's why I keep coming back to prioritizing that. But anyway, let me just, we're not going to solve that issue today. I guess a little bit more on, we had a fascinating debate, one of the best I've ever witnessed here about what is the right mix on incentives, how do we make sure we get it right, and very thoughtful people disagreed. So I just, whatever additional thoughts you have on that, I think we would benefit from, why it is that you're confident that you've hit the sweet spot and that it isn't going to suppress, and to the extent you also believe that these incentives are sweeter than some other jurisdictions and the sky didn't fall in those jurisdictions, I think that would be useful to be pointed in that direction, because that may be, history may be our best guide. I haven't had a chance, Dan, to really fully digest your compromise, but I appreciate that it is responsive to some concerns people raised about a particular part of your proposal, and that's in the package you filed?
Yes.
Okay, so we can,
Yes, it is. Yeah.
we can debate that. And I guess the other thing, I just want to make sure I understand the impact, assuming we don't change our decision that we made last week on the parking minimums. I just want to understand, and you had a chart, you had a slide in here that addressed it in part. How does that take some pressure off the other tools that you're putting in the kit? Because my hope at the time was that we could take some pressure off some other tools so that that became a bigger component of the incentive package. And I think your chart indicates that it actually has significant value in terms of to the developer, but I'd like to just understand better how that's going to work. And I thank you, Dan, and your team for excellent presentation today.
Thank you very much. Anything anybody wishes to add? I mean, we will, yeah, it's great work, and we appreciate it. I guess I'll just add that, I think as maybe Kurt might have said in his opening remarks, this is an art, not a science. And the best way we're going to figure out if we got it calibrated right is to go ahead and do it. And I think there's been a lot of time, a lot of brain power invested in trying to get this right by everybody who's got an interest in this. And I think it now falls on us to, take the plunge. And I feel we've got a reasonably crafted policy here. And, we can micromanage it forever and in the hopes of trying to get a perfect policy, but we're not going to get a perfect policy until we have a policy on the ground and we have a chance to calibrate it or recalibrate it as market conditions reveal themselves. So I'll just add that as my closing 2 cents.
Thanks to our team.
Thank you, everybody.